What if just one historical event could prove or disprove Christianity in an instant? Not a feeling, not a tradition, just one historical claim. Depending on the source, it's reported that as few as only 22% and only as high as just 66% of Christians believe that Jesus Christ literally rose from the dead. And the unbelievable thing here is simply this. It's little wonder that you're feeling empty, stuck, or tired in your walk when the church has failed to equip you with this basic tenet out of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. For if Christ be not risen, your faith is vain. Your faith is dead before you even start. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is the central issue of all of human history. So you owe it to yourself to use 15 well spent minutes considering this rather than scrolling mindlessly on social media. And the topic is dangerous and uncomfortable because once you examine the evidence for yourself, you're forever marked by your exposure to the facts. As they say, once you see it, you can't unsee it. You're cornered into taking a position, and if truth scares you, you just might want to click off right now, because here's what folks don't want to face. If Jesus rose, then Christianity is true. And if he did not rise, then the whole thing collapses. Zero room for middle ground. So let's take a look at some unique insights that I can promise you've never heard before, and ask that question: did Jesus come out of that tomb? Before debating the resurrection, it's essential that we start with widely accepted historical facts as our frame of reference. If you and I don't agree on these facts, then there's absolutely no point in talking about a resurrection, because these facts are far easier to establish than the resurrection itself. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time, because folks just circle back and debate these facts rather than dealing with the issue at hand, which is supposed to be the resurrection. So here we go. Fact number one, Jesus lived. All of the world's top scholars, many of them non-believers, agree that Jesus Christ lived. To take the position that he did not live is to render yourself a conspiracy theorist. Fact number two, he was crucified. It was a Roman execution ordered by Jewish leadership and carried out publicly. Fact number three, he was considered dead. Now, I'm not saying he was dead, I'm saying he was considered dead, but all of the interested parties in this agreed. The executioners agreed, the Romans, the Jewish leadership agreed, and his followers agreed. So what you and me think today is irrelevant to the point. Fact number four, he was buried in a known tomb. This was owned by Joseph of Arimathea. It wasn't some random trash pile. Roman guards were posted there on 24-hour watch under threat of death, and a massive stone was rolled in front of the tomb. Fact number five, Jewish leaders were certainly more highly motivated to disprove it then than you and I are talking about it today. This is self-evident. Their entire livelihoods, social, political standings, their vocations were all under threat. This is effectively why they sent Jesus to be executed to begin with. Fact number six, his disciples preached that he rose. Now, I'm not concluding that he did. I'm just saying that that's what they preached, and they preached it in the very same city where he was executed. Fact number seven, they were persecuted for preaching it by the same folks who ordered his execution and were highly motivated to quench the movement. And finally, fact number eight, the tomb was empty. Not considered empty, empty. This is the most obvious fact, because if the body had been there, the whole movement would have ended immediately. There'd be nothing to discuss here, you and me, 2,000 years later. The earliest claim is bodily resurrection, not some spiritual survival or apparition. And even the critics concede something has to have happened to the body because the tomb was empty. It's only by agreeing with these 8 obvious facts that we can actually move forward and productively discuss the resurrection. So here it goes. Proofs of Jesus' resurrection that you've never heard in 15 minutes or less. Many people like to say Jesus was a good and wise spiritual teacher, like a Buddha or like a Confucius. It sounds intellectual, it sounds safe, but it just doesn't work. because Jesus didn't present himself as merely a teacher. He claimed absolute moral perfection, all authority over heaven and earth, that your eternal destiny depends solely on your relationship to him, that he existed before Abraham, and Abraham actually existed around 2,000 years before Jesus came, that he came from eternity and he would return there, and he spoke of it with the familiarity that you and me might speak of our living rooms, that his death would be a ransom for the entire world, that there was something wrong with the world that only he could fix, and that he would die and rise again. If any ordinary person said these kinds of wild things, you would not call them wise. You'd be correct in questioning their sanity. So there are only three options left on the table. You come to what C.S. Lewis has called the startling alternative. Either Jesus was deluded, he was a lunatic, of the equivalent of a poached egg, or he may have done some good works, but ultimately he knew his claims were false, so he was a liar, or he was telling the truth, making him Lord of glory. Jesus forces you off that fence. When you examine what he actually said, the whole good and wise teacher thing just evaporates. He said there would be one definitive sign validating his claims, what he called the sign of Jonah, the resurrection. Not philosophy, not sayings, not an emotion, a historical event that could be studied for the ages. Through the 2,000 years after he was crucified on that cross, many have proposed explanations. So let's test them. Theory number one, the disciples stole the body. Then all this proves is that they knowingly lied. And I'll circle back to this later. Theory number two, the Jewish leaders stole it. But why create the very problem you're trying to stop? Theory number three, the Romans stole the body. But if that was the case, they could have just wheeled it out and shown it after in order to quench the movement. Theory number four, they went to the wrong tomb. Stupid as it sounds, the authorities could have done away with this in an instant. Just take everyone to the right one. Theory number five, hallucinations. Now, hallucinations don't occur in large groups and in separate locations at the same time. But also, hallucinations don't empty tombs. Theory number six, Jesus effectively just fainted. You know, in the coolness of the tomb, he was basically in a coma, and over the course of the 3 days, he revived. But the problem with that is that the disciples did not report an emaciated, sickly, half-dead human. They reported a live and vital Jesus, and a half-dead man certainly doesn't inspire worship as the conqueror of death. And not to mention, it doesn't account for them preaching his ascension into heaven either. Now here's the key you absolutely must take from this. Each of these theories either collapses or it requires the disciples to lie. No matter how you look at it, it boils down to just one of these two options. Either they lied or they told the truth. So let's look at 7 documented facts that occurred after the resurrection, and I'll leave it with you. First fact is the radical life change of the disciples. Peter went from a fearful threefold denial of Jesus to becoming a rock and being bold in his preaching and service. John went from being the sons of thunder, of calling down fire from heaven on his enemies, to becoming the apostle of love. And we get the idiom doubting Thomas from the apostle Thomas, who went from absolutely refusing to believe that Jesus rose to a missionary martyr, pierced to death by a Brahmin sword in the philosophic hotbed of India. All documents record cataclysmic character improvements for all those who were witnesses, and folks rarely become better people because of a lie. The second fact is their internal self-defeating honesty of their accounts. Here's some examples. Women are listed as the first witnesses. Now, not only were women not considered persuasive in that time and in that culture, their accounts were not even considered legal. So if you're lying anyway, why use invalid and unreliable witnesses to boost your story? On top of this, skeptics are very quick to point out the contradictions in the narratives of the Gospels. These guys appear to have not even been able to get their story straight. But all this proves is they didn't make any attempt, even bother, to iron out all of these differences and conspire and collude to say everything just neatly and perfectly, suspiciously even, in lockstep. Liars just don't write like this. But folks who prefer inherent honesty do, even at the cost of cohesion and appearance. Third up, multiple people sincerely believed they saw the risen Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that they actually saw him. I'm saying that they sincerely believed that they did. And not spiritual visions or just these vague feelings. Literal physical appearances are reported by individuals, groups, friends, and even skeptics. Paul even says that 500, many of whom were still alive at his writing, had actually seen the risen Jesus. Like saying, hey, go ask them, as though it's not some big issue. Fourth fact, it caused first century devout Jews to start worshipping a man. The movement explodes and something extraordinary happens. Devout Jews start worshipping a crucified dead man as Lord. And they know that the Jewish leadership will call this blasphemy, and that's the very same thing that just got Jesus crucified. So if you're a liar and you know it, why bring the added heat from the same folks who just killed your so-called failed leader? Fact number 5, the price the disciples paid. Crucially, these disciples were willing to be imprisoned, beaten, tortured, and killed. Not for some philosophy, but for an event that they say they saw. Virtually all of them were martyred in painful and torturous deaths, except John, who died isolated on the Isle of Patmos. Now, I'm willing to concede, there's plenty of folks who are willing to die for something false that they believe is true. But not many folks are willing to die for something that they themselves know is false because they invented it. All of which brings us to Dr. Gene Scott's great proof. Fact number 6, they all died alone. This one's massive because not only was it brutal martyrs' deaths, but they were separated by geography in far-flung reaches of the world, with absolutely zero peer pressure to save face and to keep up the lie, and no communication amongst themselves. Now just think about it. Any one of them could have instantly escaped certain and agonizing death simply by recanting. And better still, if they were to meet up later, none of the others would have known any better. It's the perfect lie. But not one of them budged. Something flipped these cowards from being terrified deserters into literal, unkillable witnesses. Because no historic record shows that any disciple recanted. They all preferred death to denial. Which leads me to fact number 7. Even James, the brother of Jesus, was martyred. Now, of all of the facts, this might be the weirdest one. Because James, he didn't follow Jesus during his earthly ministry. In fact, the gospel records show that James and the rest of Jesus' family actually thought that Jesus was completely out of his mind and they sought to have him put away. Yet later on, James would become the lead pastor of the church at Jerusalem. And according to early historians like Josephus and Hegesippus, James was martyred in 62 AD, thrown from the pinnacle of the temple and stoned. So ask yourself, what turns a more than skeptical brother into a willing martyr? James wasn't chasing power or status. He was already a respected religious man. The simplest and most direct explanation? Despite not truly knowing Jesus' message, James nonetheless became convinced that he rose. But, and this is crucial, more as a historical fact that he witnessed and couldn't deny, and not so much as a way of life that he'd actually absorbed. And even if you look at all of these previous facts and decide, no, the disciples lied, there remains just one aberration that cannot be ignored. The bonus fact, Paul's conversion. It's what Pastor Melissa Scott calls the star witness argument. Because the Apostle Paul is literally the ultimate outsider to this event. He persecuted Christians and even approved of their executions. He had education, pedigree, prestige, and rising influence as a Pharisee. Then suddenly and miraculously he converts, and not casually either. He loses status, suffers beatings and imprisonment, and then ultimately death. Now, why would a man who's on the other side abandon power, wealth, family, honor, community, career, and even safety for a message that he knew was false and would also get him killed? Because Paul's conversion makes no sense for a lie, but it makes perfect sense if he really did encounter the risen Jesus on that Damascus road. Because of all the world's religions, Christianity is by far the very easiest to discredit. It don't take Stevie Wonder to see. You've just got to prove that Jesus stayed dead and it's all over. We can all go home. Buddha, he never claimed to be God. He just claimed this eightfold path thing. Hey, try this. It worked for me, might work for you, give it a shot. Confucius, he preached an ethic for a better society, certainly didn't claim any divinity. And Muhammad claimed a vision. He never said he was divine, let alone one with God. This idea offends Muslims. And Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad, they're all dead. And not one of them left an empty tomb. And the empty tomb is the great inconvenient truth. Because in 2,000 years of trying, folks far more invested than you and me, and folks far smarter, have not only failed to disprove Jesus' resurrection, they've also even failed to gather on just one single valid alternate theory as their rallying cry. Not even one of their alternates has gained traction, let alone prominence, amongst deniers. But the sudden and sincere belief of these fumbling, uneducated fishermen disciples that they'd actually seen the risen Jesus, and immediately after his public execution, in a way that they knew would get them killed, is inconceivable, if not true. And it's not an ideological drift that flowers some generations later. No, culture, history, and even their religion changes in an instant, like a bolt from the blue. And that's why, simple and concise, it's the resurrection that best explains why ordinary, frightened people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose became unshakably convinced eyewitnesses of something they had every reason and every investment not to believe, and were willing to die alone with only their consciences as their detractor instead of denying their allegiance to Jesus. Because liars don't die alone, retaining only their inward integrity before some unseen God. If Jesus rose, then he is who he claimed to be. And you now see, Christianity isn't about blind faith, not even close. It's about whether you've been honest enough with yourself, honest enough to examine the hard evidence. If the resurrection is true, God has entered history in a tent of human flesh. Death is not the end for us. Faith is based on fact, on history and reason. And Jesus isn't some spiritual teacher in a pantheon of equals. No, he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is why we can rest assured that no matter the pains, the anxieties, the fears and the hurts that we experience in this life, we can put our trust in the one who pierced that rock, conquered death, conquered this world, and overcame it all. Because he promises you and me that he will not leave us nor forsake us, not even until the end of time. And because he rose, because he lives, Jesus Christ is a surer foundation than anything that our five senses can perceive in this entire world. After all, it's the Hebrews writer says that it was Jesus who was the very speaking agent that brought about and created all that we see with just his word alone. And he is the author and finisher of faith, because the resurrection is the starting point of the Christian faith. And Christianity is Christ risen, Christ in you, the hope of glory. So where do you stand? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're genuine about finally breaking free in Christ, watch this video next.